How tight is this race in your state?
Well, first, I have to say, I always do enjoy when Donald Trump reminds the audience how much he would rather be somewhere else than being with him or being with his crowd in Detroit or somewhere in Pennsylvania. But I will say it's always sunny here in Philadelphia. I happen to be proud to be born and raised and live here in the Commonwealth of PA, the Keystone State, and I think the state that will determine the next president of the United States, just as it did in both 2016 and 2020. For this election, it is incredibly close. I think it's a one-point race. If the election were held today, I think Kamala Harris would win by that 1 point. But that said, it could still go either way, which in many ways is probably, for all of the things that have happened this year, the fact that Pennsylvania is a one-point race and could still go either way is probably the least surprising.
Boy, a one-point race. And so you wonder what it is that either causes one of these candidates to break out or maintain, I guess, a one-point lead. I spoke with one of your old colleagues from Capitol Hill, Pat Toomey, former senator of Pennsylvania. And here's what he had to say about the issues, in fact, the key to winning your state, Pennsylvania, this November. Here's what he said.
I don't think it's a single issue, probably. It's not one of the giveaways that Kamala Harris is promising, or for that matter, some of the pandering that Donald Trump has done. I think the economic issue is a sort of broad gut check. Do you feel like you're better off than you were several years ago? Personally, I think it's still advantage Republican.
So obviously you guys don't see eye to eye on that, and that's not a big shocker, Congressman. The former senator pointed to the economy, kind of a broad issue here. And I find the closing arguments that we're hearing now really interesting. Donald Trump is going for the border, hard on immigration in every speech. That's how he answers most every question, no matter what issue it starts with. Kamala Harris, as we heard earlier in the program, is calling on Trump to release his health records, sit for a 60 Minutes interview, and do another debate. She's talking about how his staff is hiding him away. Is that the most effective closing argument for this campaign? Or does Kamala Harris need to keep hammering away on the economy?
Well, you know, I do think that for a certain group of voters who have deep economic concerns because they were badly impacted by first the pandemic and then the global spike in inflation that happened in 2021 has taken a while to unwind. I think for that segment of the population, the economy will still be front of mind. But there are also two other main sort of buckets of issues that will determine the votes of a whole lot of people. And that is first the cultural issues, whether it's abortion and I would include immigration in there as well. I mean, the reality is there are a lot of people in Pennsylvania as well as the United States today who are not voting, frankly, in strict accordance with what might be in their economic self-interest because of their deep concern of those cultural issues. And then there's another bucket of issues that I would call the democracy issues. And these are directly about Donald Trump. And frankly, Pat Toomey, who even though he's on the other side of the aisle, he and I always worked well together. He, Liz Cheney, others are perhaps examples of the kind of Republicans who live in and around either southeastern Pennsylvania or nearby, who, if you had a more normal Republican presidential nominee, might be inclined to vote Republican, but who just can't bring themselves to put someone like Donald Trump back in the Oval Office out of fear of what Donald Trump would do. I mean, this is a man, after all, who incited an insurrection that injured more than 140 Capitol Police officers on January 6th. And his sort of rhetoric that he's talking about during this campaign only brings back the sort of fears that he would even be worse the second time around. So, yes, the economy will matter. It'll be important for a certain group of voters. But I wouldn't say that it's the only issue or even now the major issue. There are those other buckets of issues out there as well that will determine the minds of a lot of voters.
Well, Congressman, the Harris campaign has said at her rally this evening in Erie, Pennsylvania, the vice president plans to ratchet up warnings about the risk a second Donald Trump term poses to the American people if he returns to power. So perhaps leaning more on that other issue you mentioned. When we consider that, though, especially when we consider what happened in Pennsylvania in 2020, it took several days to get the results. At one point, Donald Trump was calling for the stopping of the count when he was winning, not all the mail-in ballots had been counted because you can't start that in your state until the morning of Election Day. How concerned are you, sir, about how long it could take for us to know definitively who won?
Yeah, so first, let's just be clear about the situation in Pennsylvania. We are prohibited, unlike Florida, unlike North Carolina, unlike almost every state that is early voting, uniquely in Pennsylvania, our Republican-controlled legislature prevents us from doing what's called pre-canvassing of mail-in ballots. That means that process in Pennsylvania can only begin on Election Day. That is what leads to the long delays. It was compounded by the fact that in 2020, of course, we were still in the middle of the pandemic, so many people voted by mail, myself included, really for the first time. Now, the good news is that in 2024, the pandemic is over. There shouldn't be nearly as many people voting by mail this time as there were last time. But all that having been said, I have no doubt that come 8:30, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, Republicans will be winning this election in Pennsylvania, but it will be the red mirage because Democrats tend in much bigger numbers to vote by mail over Republicans. Those ballots, while they won't take 3 or 4 days to count this time, I still do think it will take a full day for all of the votes by mail to be counted. So this is an entirely avoidable situation. It was created by the Republican legislature, and it will unfortunately empower Donald Trump to pretend like there's something nefarious going on when there really isn't.
Do you expect ticket splitting to be a phenomenon in Pennsylvania, Congressman? And I ask you that because Senator Bob Casey is looking like he's headed for a win, at least if the election were held today, even if it were by a couple of percentage points here. If Bob Casey wins the race for Senate, does that mean Kamala Harris won Pennsylvania?
So first, I mean, I do expect Senator Casey to be reelected. I think he'll run probably a few points ahead of where the presidential ticket is. I would point out, at the risk of sounding like I'm bragging, ticket splitting also happens in my congressional district. I ran 5 points ahead of the top of the ticket in my congressional district. So there's all sorts of ticket splitting that still happens in Pennsylvania. I'm right next to Bucks County, where Joe Biden won it by 6 points last election. And then the folks there turn around and voted for a Republican for Congress. So it still happens in our state, probably more than most other swing states. And I fully expect that you'll see all those sorts of splits again this November.